ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi there. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know we've just announced a big live national tour. Conversations Live will be coming to your capital city in August, and we'd love to see you there. Tickets are on sale now. Just go to the Conversations website to find out more. Marcel Dirsus is here today. Marcel is a political scientist, and he's the author of a book on tyrants, the kings, emperors, and presidents for life who are responsible for so much of the human misery in the world. Marcel has a quote in his book from Winston Churchill, who said, "You see these dictators on their pedestals, surrounded by the bayonets of their soldiers and the truncheons of their police. On all sides, they're guarded by masses of armed men, cannons, aeroplanes, fortifications and the like. They boast and vaunt themselves before the world, yet in their hearts there is unspoken fear." Marcel says that although these tyrants look like strong men, they are right to be afraid. They know they could meet a grisly end at any moment, from a mass uprising, from a foreign invasion, or from the gun of an assassin sent by someone within the presidential palace. Marcel Dirsus has put the tyrants under the microscope to understand their strengths and weaknesses and the means by which they might be overthrown and the statue in the square brought down. Marcel's book is called How Tyrants Fall. Hi, Marcel.
Thank you very much for having me.
You say the insecurity of tyrants can be illustrated by something you call the golden gun paradox. Can you please explain what that is?
I think in our democracies, many people have the idea that these leaders are almost all-powerful, that they don't rely on anybody to maintain power, and that really they can do whatever they want on any given day. But in reality, it doesn't work like that. Every leader, whether it's a democratic one or whether it's a tyrant, needs others in order to stay in power. The question is, who do they need and how many do they need? So in a functioning democracy, you need a comparatively large share of the population in order to take power and to maintain it. And the reason for that is that you need to win elections. But in these types of systems, dictators, tyrants, kings, they only need a tiny share of the population to maintain their power. Usually it's the generals, the intelligence officials, or the oligarchs, perhaps even their own families. And at first, that sounds very comforting because you can ignore the vast majority of the population. And as a result, you have a lot more room for maneuver. But oftentimes, what these tyrants find is that it can become a trap because democratic leaders can afford to lose 100, 200, 300,000 voters and be perfectly fine. But if you're somebody like Putin or Kim Jong-un or Gaddafi and you lose 10, 20, 30 generals or intelligence officials, you can lose power. And the added problem is that much of these regimes is built on a perception of inevitability. So these regimes look stable until they aren't, because people come to realize that there could be an alternative. You know, maybe we can get rid of Gaddafi. Maybe there can be a new leader.
Things are so bad, literally anything would be better than Gaddafi or whoever.
Exactly right. And this is why dictators always want to project this image of strength and this image of inevitability, because they don't want their people to believe that there could be an alternative. But then when that moment does come, when there is this defining crisis and people realize that they could be brought down, very often people find out that the emperor has no clothes. So yes, he might have a gun, literally in gold, as Gaddafi had, but at the moment when dictators would most need these symbols of power, they become useless because the mirage has gone up.
Gaddafi literally had a golden gun, a gun made of gold?
He literally had a golden gun, and it was supposedly given to him by one of his sons. But when the rebellion took hold and when the rebellion became stronger in Libya, his end, of course, was incredibly gruesome. And in one of the most defining images of the conflict, that golden gun was taken from him, and one of the rebels held it up as a symbol of celebration. And in that moment, Gaddafi couldn't believe what was happening to him. He had genuinely convinced himself that he was not only the king of kings of Africa, but that he was beloved, that ordinary Libyans loved him. And when he was meeting his fate, he couldn't compute what was occurring to him.
In the end, he was pulled out of a sewer, butchered with a bayonet, and then beaten to death pretty much, wasn't he?
It was a horrendous end. And to add insult to injury, not only that, but his near-naked body was displayed in a meat locker of a local mall. So he didn't even get the customary quick burial that you would have ordinarily had in Islam. And when a local man was asked about it, he said that Gaddafi had chosen his own fate. You know, if he had been a better man, this wouldn't have happened to him. And indeed, when political scientists looked at this, they found that more than 2/3 of personalist dictators are forced into exile, imprisoned, or killed when they lose power. So not only are you in this precarious situation where you can lose power very quickly if your key lieutenants desert you, but if you do lose power, there's also a decent chance that you're going to lose your freedom or even your life. And that, of course, sets totally different incentives. So if you think about, let's say, the Australian Prime Minister, you know, when an Australian Prime Minister steps down, they might take up golf, or they give speeches to banks, or they just enjoy time with their family. But when these types of leaders lose power, the odds of a tranquil retirement are drastically different, and that completely changes their incentives.
There are different subspecies of tyrants. They come in different shapes and sizes, but generally I think as a species, they're quite different from the rest of us. How would you define those differences, Marcel?
They are deeply weird people.
No.
I mean, that's not exactly a scientific term.
They've all got strange hair. That's one thing I've tended to find over the years.
Strange hair and very strange brains. So these people are very different to us. These people are narcissists. They love themselves. By and large, they have no empathy for others. They might be having a completely normal conversation with somebody at noon, and then in the evening they might be ordering their death. And of course they have to do this sort of thing with some regularity, which is not something that normal people would be able to cope with. So if they worked in an ordinary job, in an office environment, in a cubicle somewhere, somebody like Saddam Hussein would be a terrible co-worker. But in the environment in which they operate, much of what they do can actually be rational. You know, oftentimes I think we look at these leaders and we like to tell ourselves that they have just completely lost their mind. Because the alternative, that there can be some rationality in the madness and the misery, is so discomforting to us that we choose not to believe it. But in fact, the vast majority of these people are rational within that system. It is rational for them to torture. It is rational for them to kill, because it is a way to survive in power.
Human beings will want to look at a dictator and say they're either mad or they're monsters. The ugly truth is they're often very rational and human too.
And the problem arises when you give any one human too much power. I mean, I can barely imagine being a prime minister. And prime ministers have to deal with an independent press. They have to deal with courts. There are all kinds of things that limit their power. But some of these leaders can literally have people killed with the snap of a finger. And that almost inevitably produces catastrophic outcomes. But if these leaders lose that rationality, if they're no longer able to make rational calculations, they often lose power very quickly. So one good example for this is Marcel Dirsus, who ruled a small West African country during the Cold War. And he literally lost his mind. And he knew that there was something wrong with him, because on a trip to Spain, he once had himself treated by a psychiatrist. But back at home, he couldn't be treated by anybody, because every doctor that could have been suitable had either fled abroad or his regime has had them killed. So there he was. He would walk around his palace screaming out the names of the people that he had killed. And in one anecdote, he asked his servants to lay the table for 8 guests. And when none of them arrived, he spoke to them completely normally as if they were there. So this was a man who has genuinely lost it. And as a result, the people around him that kept him in power, those generals, those intelligence officials, decided that they need to get rid of him very quickly. Because, of course, they could have been next. There was no point extending any loyalty anymore to somebody who could kill you at any moment. So they toppled him and shot him very, very quickly.
Marcel, you grew up in West Germany, which has enjoyed stable democracy pretty much since the late 1940s. And when you finished your degree, you decided to go and work in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, somewhat less politically stable. Why did you want to go and work there?
You know, when I was doing my bachelor's, I told myself that I was not going to do a master's. And when I sat in the library for my master's, I said, okay, I'm definitely not doing a PhD. I'm going to get out. I'm going to see the world. I'm going to experience something different. And I asked around a little bit, and eventually I got a job offer to work for a brewery in the Congo. As you can imagine, my family was thrilled, my mother especially. But I just wanted to do something different and see something different. When I was there, I thought I had gotten away from politics. I was just doing my day job. But then one day in Kinshasa, which is the capital, there was a coup attempt. So military installations were attacked, the country's main airport was attacked, and the public broadcaster was actually taken over by coup plotters. And at that time, I was on the other side of the country in Lubumbashi. And I would walk to work, and ordinarily this would have been one of the best parts of my day. There were palm trees and all these exotic birds, and it was just very calm and very peaceful. But then all of a sudden, I heard a shot. And then I heard another shot, and another shot, and then I heard an explosion. And the shots came from 3 different directions. And of course, in hindsight, I'd love to say that I was super cool about it and that I was not at all scared. But I was very scared because I was more than 1,500 kilometers away from the German embassy. And I knew that if things went really, really wrong, I also wouldn't be able to fly out because when things do go wrong, the airport's closed. So I turn around and I go talk to one of my colleagues and I say, what is going on? What are we going to do? And he just looked at me and he said, nothing. We're going to do nothing. There were shootings before. Usually everything was fine. So it is what it is. We're just going to continue working. And I did continue working, but that day always stuck with me because I could never understand how people could be so calm about this type of political instability. And I wanted to know, how does a coup work? Why do coups fail? How do these people stay in power? And what happens when they do? So inevitably, I did go back to Germany and I did do that PhD.
You say that being a dictator, being a tyrant, is a bit like being stuck on a treadmill. You can never get off. When you say that, do you mean they don't want to get off or they don't dare get off the treadmill that they have mounted and are running on?
Bit of both. So oftentimes when tyrants have ascended to power, they want to maintain that power because there are quite a few things that are nice about it. Oftentimes these people are incredibly rich. Often they're even the richest people in their entire country. And also they are somebody. Maybe they've come from nothing. Maybe they were born into a very simple household and all of a sudden they are this great leader. They are perhaps the king of kings of Africa. But more importantly, they can't step down even if they want to. And the reason for this is structural. So to stay in power in these types of systems, you have to do horrendous things with some regularity. And as a result of that, you have many enemies. So if you now want to step down, or if you were to try to turn the country into a democracy, you will have to find a right successor. And you need a successor who's powerful enough to protect you, but who doesn't want to crush you when they do have that power. And that is an almost impossible combination. Because if you are that successor, and you are powerful enough to protect the previous ruler, why would you? As long as that previous ruler is around, he's always going to be a threat. So the rational thing to do is to try to disappear him or to kill him. And usually that's exactly what they do.
By some accounts, it's Vladimir Putin, not Elon Musk, who's the richest man in the world. He's managed to embezzle bazillions of dollars out of the Russian state economy. No one's expecting Vladimir Putin to say, you know what, I've done all the hard work, I'm getting older now, I want to go off and enjoy my billions. No one's expecting him to do that. But it has happened in the past. Augusto Pinochet in Chile decided he was going to step down and retire and tried to put some safeguards in place. What insane risks was he taking in doing that?
People do sometimes try, although it's important to remember that sometimes they voluntarily step down as a result of other people making it all but impossible for them to continue in power. Even though they say, I'm doing this out of my own volition, this is what I genuinely want, usually there's somebody around them who may have helped them to reach that conclusion.
What about tyrants like Idi Amin or Bashar of Iran or Assad of Syria who take the golden parachute? They get out and they accept exile in a foreign country. Is that getting harder and harder for tyrants to do these days?
Usually these types of leaders try to stay in power for as long as they humanly can. But if the moment does arise where they need to flee because they genuinely feel that there's no other option, they have to have a plan. And a lot of the times they don't. And as you say, it's gotten more and more difficult over time to find the right place. So during the Cold War, it was often comparatively easy for tyrants to find a nice place to enjoy their retirement, because both sides were quite happy to provide a safe haven to their dictators. But over time, democracies have become more and more reluctant to host these types of leaders. And that means that choices now are much reduced. So when somebody like Bashar al-Assad is trying to make a decision as to where to go, he doesn't have that French option. He doesn't have that American option. And it meant that the least bad option was probably Russia. But the thing to keep in mind is that these leaders can never be genuinely safe. First of all, because they are hated. Bashar al-Assad was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. His regime barrel-bombed civilians. And when they then went to hide in basement, it used chemical weapons to kill them. So just because he has left that palace doesn't mean that his enemies have evaporated into thin air. And the other thing to consider is that, yes, he may have gotten a promise by Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin is mortal, and he will get toppled or die at some point. And there's no telling that Putin's successor is going to honor the promise that Putin may have made to Assad.
So does this mean in the long run, dictators see all this? They're all students of each other's regimes. They all look around and see what everyone else is doing. The incentive then, more and more, is for dictators just to take the apocalypse option, to stay in office no matter what and die in the presidential palace.
Absolutely. And this is also very difficult for democracies because on the one hand, you don't want these leaders to enjoy their retirement. You don't want them to sip cocktails, on a yacht somewhere or to enjoy Hawaii. But the flip side of that is that you give them more and more of an incentive to try to kill their way into staying in power. And that, of course, is not good either. So in German, we would call this a choice between the plague and cholera. All right? If you get that call at 3 a.m., there is no good option, but you have to make a choice.
Vladimir Putin thought that invading Ukraine would be easy, but it turned out he was getting bad information all along about the state of his military, and a lot of those stories have come to light since then. How much of a problem does a tyrant like Putin have in getting reliable, honest information from his own people?
It's almost impossible. This is something that is often called the dictator's dilemma. So as a dictator, you never know who is actually loyal and who's just pretending to be, because, of course, the cost of telling the truth to a dictator can be massive. So if I tell my boss an uncomfortable truth, I might get demoted, or perhaps he yells at me. But if you tell the truth to Vladimir Putin, you might go to a gulag, or you might die. So as a result of that, everybody around Putin lies to him, because it's the rational thing to do. But over time, as people lie to you each and every day, you become more and more detached from reality. So for somebody like Putin, it's incredibly difficult to understand even what is happening in his own country, let alone in some other country.
But Putin would know this too. He's a former secret policeman. Part of him would know he's being fed bullshit from his own people, surely, Marcel. And does that create a kind of an agony in his own mind?
It has to, but it's just very, very difficult to get around that. Because, of course, if you are one of the advisors and you see people who have told the truth disappear, or at the very least get demoted, everybody knows what the incentives are. So it could be that Putin sits at his laughably long table and tells his people to tell him the truth, but they won't because they know what has previously happened to people who have done so.
Roman emperors, when they were in need of cash, Augustus, the great Augustus did this. They'd enact prescriptions where they'd round up senators that looked vaguely like an enemy, perhaps, or a potential enemy, and declare them to be enemies of the states, strip them of their wealth, and probably have them killed. And this had two functions for them. It would enable them to eliminate real and potential enemies and to gather the vast amount of the wealth from the estates from these wealthy senators. That seemed like quite of an effective way, a grisly and monstrous way for them to stay in power. Is that still a thing? Do dictators still do that? They capture their enemies, strip them of their wealth, and sent them off to a gulag or into a courtyard to be shot?
So, purges and repression are a bit of an art and a science in and of themselves. So usually what you try to do as a dictator is to not use too much violence if you can help it. But every now and then you want to make a statement. And you see this over and over again. So people fall out of windows in Russia, or in North Korea, somebody might get executed with an anti-aircraft gun. But that's selective if the dictatorship can help it. Usually you don't want to apply violence to a broad group of people, but you just want to make that one example.
Why not to a broad group of people?
Whenever you use violence against a broad group of people, there's a threat that things could get out of hand. But if you just use it against one advisor or maybe two advisors, and you have a somewhat believable reason to do it, you can use another mechanism that is really common in these regimes. So you could think that everybody in the immediate nucleus of somebody like Putin would reject purges because they think they might be next. But initially, there's often a different mechanism. Because if you imagine this table and you imagine 10 men sitting around it, usually it is mostly men, and somebody gets purged, initially it can be quite good for the other 9 people that sit around the table. Because you now have a cake of the same size, but it gets divided into different pieces. So somebody who didn't get purged might now get more money and get more power. So initially, oftentimes, the people who didn't get purged are actually supportive of the purge. But there is a moment where it tips, especially if people disappear for no good reason at all. Then dictators might find themselves in a situation where the ministers start to sweat because that table becomes emptier and emptier. And then there is the risk that they try to cooperate to stop the leader.
One of the most chilling things I've ever seen in my life, Marcel, is a video, you can see it on YouTube, of a Ba'athist party meeting that was held pretty much not long after Saddam Hussein came to power in Iraq. The party members, senior party figures are sitting there in this theatre. Saddam's sitting on a stage, and I don't think he says a word throughout the whole proceedings. He's smoking a cigar like a gangster. And his flunky is standing there in front of a microphone, reading out a list of names of people who are to be purged. And the name is read, but the name might get a tick and you're okay. But then the next 2 names down, they get dragged out of the theatre. And this weird thing happens in that room. You can see everyone's heads start to swim. And then a couple of them jump to their feet and start chanting Saddam Hussein's name with this kind of mad intensity. And the rest of the room is doing that, even as their names are being read out and being dragged out of the theatre to be shot.
Yeah, and I think, again, it gets at just how weird some of these regimes can be. You know, this is the type of thing that happens when you give one man too much power. That is the logic that is internal to these systems of governing.
Joseph Stalin, the leader of the former Soviet Union, conducted famous series of purges throughout the 1930s. He killed all his old friends effectively in the Bolshevik Party, then went through the membership. And then he turned on the army. He took his most talented generals, put them on trumped-up charges of treason, and had them shot. What dangers did that expose Stalin to once he'd done that, once he'd purged his senior military leadership?
It's very rare for things to be free in politics, and the type of government that these people run is no exception to that. So usually what happens is that dictators try to solve one problem, but they create another problem in the process, and that comes back to haunt them at some later point. So somebody like Stalin was obviously incredibly worried about his own military. He had consolidated his power, but he knew that if there was somebody who could still topple him, it was probably the men with guns. So one of the things that he set out to do is to purge them. Initially, there might have been some people implicated who had actually opposed Stalin. But over time, these purges became so vast that they sucked in thousands and thousands of people. And many of these people were not just comparatively loyal to Stalin, but they were also quite competent. So these were the type of men that you would have needed in order to wage war or to defend yourself if, let's say, Nazi Germany attacks you. So over time, by purging his military, Stalin systematically reduced the military effectiveness of his own country. And by going so far with these purges, Stalin ultimately threatened his own rule because he put the survival of the entire Soviet Union at risk.
He hired a secret policeman to do his dirty work, then published an article in Pravda saying, oh, this guy's gone too far. He's outrageous what he's been doing, when, of course, he'd just been following orders. And the secret police guy got purged himself. How important is it for the dictator to make these purges a public spectacle rather than conduct them in private?
I think, again, the importance of that is to send that signal. You know, you don't necessarily need to kill everybody who might become a problem. If you could let them know that becoming a problem will immediately lead them to a gulag or to their death. So, in a way, you achieve more than one thing by doing it in public.
You mentioned there that the purge of the army, the Red Army by Stalin, left it quite vulnerable to attack, which is what happened when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. You say this is a particularly dangerous moment for the tyrant. Why is open warfare so dangerous for a tyrant?
So usually tyrants are more worried about their own soldiers than foreign soldiers because they know that many a tyrant has been toppled in a coup. So one of the things that they set out to do is to try to manage their military somehow. And a big part of that involves restructuring their security services. So usually when you look at a democracy, what you will find is a somewhat unified chain of command. So you have one general on top. That big man gives an order, and then it flows down. What you see in these dictatorial system of government is that tyrants split their security services into multiple parts. So instead of just having your regular military, you have your regular military, and then you have some sort of party-based militia that consists of 1 million people. And you also have a militarized palace guard. And the reason why you do this is to send a signal to that general that if he does try to topple you, he will have to go through that militia. He will have to go through that militarized palace guard. And that, of course, makes it less likely that the general will even try to topple you. And presumably, when leaders do this, they will feel quite clever and pleased with themselves because they have significantly reduced an important threat. But once again, this doesn't come free. Because if you coup-proof your military, if you structure it in a way that it doesn't topple you, it becomes worse as waging war. Because the reason why democracies have this unified chain of command is because it works. If you want to wage a war, if you want to defend yourself, it is good to have clear structures, to not have overlaps, to always know who's in charge. So they win one thing, but they lose another.
One of the aspects of dictatorships, tyrannies, is the absolute labradors that the tyrants will appoint to work for them. They will very often promote people with little to recommend them for their post except their blind loyalty to the leader. That's what's happened to Vladimir Putin. Arguably, Donald Trump has appointed similar quality people to his administration as well. What about Xi Jinping? He seems to have avoided this problem, doesn't he? He seems to have very competent people working for him.
One of the advantages that the CCP has had over time, I would argue, is that they haven't gone too far on the personalization. So yes, it's not a democratic system of government, but there are some things that have constrained the leader over the last couple of decades. And whenever you have these types of checks and balances, and it doesn't have to be judges, it doesn't have to be an independent press, but whenever the leader is constrained in some meaningful way, it reduces the chance that he makes catastrophic mistakes. But in actual fact, I could imagine a scenario in which Xi Jinping's success at centralizing power in his hands ultimately leads to his downfall because it invites catastrophic mistakes.
He's going through a few ministers at the moment too, isn't he? He's sacked quite a few ministers over the last few years and reappointed new ones, sacked more, reappointed new ones. I suppose that's another way of keeping people on their toes.
Absolutely, and this is something that you see in dictatorships very often. You know, it's almost like a game of musical chairs. You always want to make sure that people are not in one place for too long. You don't want to allow them to coordinate with each other, and you almost want them to watch each other constantly as well. So what we just discussed with reference to coup-proofing, for example, this idea of splitting your services into multiple parts that then compete with each other, is almost always also replicated with intelligence officials. Only that this time, not only do you split your intelligence service into 3, but you also make sure that they have overlapping responsibilities, because that also means that they can watch each other. And that makes it even more difficult to oppose you.
One of the key principles that's been identified about Adolf Hitler's regime was a thing that the historian Ian Kershaw called a process of working towards the Führer. Hitler wasn't like Stalin, who was at his desk every day. He'd, get up in the middle of the day, have a tea and cakes, walk around, have a few conversations, and left the administration of the regime to overlapping mini empires, if you like, to squabble amongst themselves, to fight for power, and to come up with solutions to problems that Hitler had identified.
I think there are quite a few leaders like that. The advantage of that, of course, is that it does make it more difficult for your enemies to form a united front against you, because you have this constant competition, you have this constant struggle amongst the different parts that maintain your power, that keep the regime alive. And as a result of that, it's incredibly difficult to coordinate, to try to topple you. And the other benefit that could be is that depending on just how incompetent that leader might be, even an administration divided into multiple parts might do a better job of running the country than that one man could do.
It seems also to be the province of very charismatic leaders. Leaders who give the impression that they're miracle workers. They can pull some miraculous result out of their brains or out of the sky or from the gods. You've got the example of Papa Doc Duvalier, the dictator of Haiti, what were some of the ways he was able to convince his people that he was able to call on all kinds of dark powers to come to his aid?
Every dictator needs some story to tell. And these stories differ, of course, hugely. So some leaders will say that they have turned barren deserts into marvels of modern engineering, that they have brought prosperity, that they have expanded the power of the realm. But strength is crucial. The perception of strength. You want people to believe that it is almost impossible to topple you. And in the case of Duvalier, for example, he genuinely made many people in his country believe that he could read their minds, that he was almost not a mortal figure, but that he was somewhere between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living. And the result of that was that not only did he get some legitimacy, but he also terrified people. And he terrified people in a way that was very cost-effective to him. Because whenever you do need to club people into submission, you open yourself to all kinds of things going wrong. So the ideal scenario, the type of thing that you want to see as a tyrant, is for people to not even try to oppose you because they think that you're an immortal being.
One of the principal dangers to the tyrant is the prospect of a military coup d'etat. I'm going to bring up the Roman Empire again because I'm one of those strange creatures who thinks of the Roman Empire 3 times a week. Marcel, the very cynical emperor Septimius Severus was said to have advised his sons, who were to be his successors, take care of the army, scorn all other men. Are they the most serious potential threats to the tyrant?
The closer you are to the tyrant, the more influence you will usually have. And the military and the wider security services are key because they have a comparative advantage when it comes to violence. And the added benefit that they have is that they can topple the leader with very few men. So if you think about a rebellion, for example, it will usually involve hundreds of thousands or perhaps even millions of people. But when a coup is planned well, all it can take is 200, 300, maybe 400 people. And the reason for that lies in the mechanism by which coups work. So if you were to plan a coup, and please don't, but if you were to plan a coup, what you want to focus on is the capital city. And really, you don't even need the entire city. All you need is the Ministry of Defense, the intelligence headquarters, maybe Parliament and the presidential palace, some key bridges, and the public broadcaster. And if you can manage to take over these highly symbolic places in the capital city, you can present strength. And that is key in these moments. Because during a coup, you usually have 3 factions. On the one hand, you have the incumbent and his closest allies. And on the other hand, you have the coup plotters. And again, most groups tend to be kind of small. And the vast majority of the men with guns tend to be in the middle.
That we're waiting and seeing how it's all going to turn out.
That's exactly right, because in that situation, you don't want to bet on the wrong horse, because betting on the wrong horse will often mean death. So the rational thing for the vast majority of soldiers to do is to simply wait and see. And if they turn on the TV, if they turn on the radio, and they see these coup plotters, having taken charge of parliament, having captured the leader, then they will react accordingly. They will think, my gosh, the plotters will win. If we don't join them, we might get killed, so we should join them as soon as possible.
So the impression of inevitability of success is key here for the coup plotters.
Yeah, it's almost as if that perception of strength ultimately turns into strength. So by presenting yourself as more likely to succeed, you become more likely to succeed. And this is why it's so dangerous. This is why coups are so difficult to prevent, because all it takes is a couple of hundred people. And that is very, very difficult to stop, even for the most effective tyrants.
Very often tyrants will try and protect themselves from a coup by having a palace guard around them. And they won't be normally from the military. They'll be people whose loyalty is utterly directed towards the president for life, the king, the emperor, and so on. What are the benefits and risks in having a palace guard, a Praetorian guard around you if you're the tyrant?
It's a tricky thing to do because, again, at first you would think it's very clever. You don't pick regular soldiers, you take these super soldiers that have some kind of special loyalty to you. So perhaps they belong to the same tribe, or perhaps they've gone through a series of tests to prove just how loyal they are. All of these leaders have some special palace guard. And it is clever in a way because it is oftentimes very effective at protecting you. But the problem is, if you choose the most lethal people to protect you, they can also turn around and kill you. And of course, in history, that has happened again and again and again.
So The coup plotters make their move. They don't take all those key institutions. They don't project the impression of inevitability and strength, and the coup fails. What kind of a moment is that for the tyrant as the coup against him fails?
Probably the best day of the year. The first advantage that you have is that now you have a great reason to use repression. Your enemies have shown themselves, your enemies have attempted to topple you, and now you have a quote-unquote reasonable excuse in order to get rid of them. But the other benefit is that it's a brief moment in time in which that dictator's dilemma that we previously discussed doesn't apply. So for a brief moment, that fog that you operate under is lifted, and you can tell who is genuinely loyal and who was just pretending to be. And in fact, there are stories of leaders who have deliberately let plots against their rule unfold because they wanted to enjoy that brief moment. So there was a queen in Madagascar who, according to legend, did just this. She found out that there was a plot developing against her rule, and ordinarily you would expect the queen to intercept as soon as possible because the risk of these coups is so high and because you want to minimize it. But she let it go on, and she let it go on, and she let it go on. And subsequently, more and more of her enemies showed themselves, and she was able to pick them off one by one.
Let's talk about surveillance. In the old Stalinist dictatorships, they were surveillance states. The homes and workplaces of dissidents or potential dissidents were bugged. People were brought in to report on them. Now in China, the CCP is able to employ extraordinary technological advances to strengthen the tools of the surveillance state to an unimagined degree, where there's facial recognition software, cameras everywhere in public. I wonder if there are dangers for a state that indulges in hyper-paranoid, extreme high-tech surveillance technology like these.
That's a good question. I think there has been a fundamental change in the way that surveillance has worked. So if you look at something like the Stasi, for example, or if you look at the Soviet system, you needed all these people. You needed people to go in and open those letters. And nowadays, surveillance is vastly more effective than even Stasi agents could have ever hoped for. And of course, it's not just something that happens in a country like China. There are also democracies that develop software that they then sell to other dictatorships or to other democracies that can do some terrifying things.
And China's selling this surveillance technology to other autocracies around the world too.
Absolutely. And some of the software is crazy. I mean, nowadays you don't even need to open the wrong WhatsApp message or the wrong email. All it takes is for somebody to have your number. And if they have your number and the right resources, they can listen to everything you say on the phone. They can listen to everything. They can read everything that you type. So you can become totally transparent at the click of a button. And I think for the most part, that is incredibly beneficial to these regimes. But of course, there are also some elements of technology that are very attractive to the opposition. And one of those areas is mobilization. Because back in the day, it would have been extremely difficult for people to mobilize against their own regime, whereas now it is much easier for people to come together and to chat and to figure out a common plan of action.
Some tyrannies survive by setting one group of people within the nation against another, often on a tribal or a racial basis, and this will often lead to some kind of an armed insurgency. And interestingly, you say these armed insurgencies really aren't very often very effective at bringing down dictators. Well, I wonder why that is.
Part of it is modern technology. Back in the day, it was often comparatively easy for rebels to bring down leaders. But now we live in a totally different world. Leaders can surveil their people. It's much easier for central governments to even reach the rebels in which they might try to be hiding. There are drones, there's surveillance software. So that is a part of the difficulty. But really, the largest difficulty lies in the type of warfare they have to wage. So initially, when rebels oppose a tyrant, it's a ragtag group of bandits. They can hide out in the mountains, they can hide out in the forests. They might attack government troops here, they might attack a settlement there. And that can be enough to survive, but it is rarely enough to actually topple the tyrant. And to topple the tyrant, you will need to concentrate your forces and fight in a different way. But at this moment of concentration, the regime often gains the upper hand again, because it is this type of fighting that regimes excel at.
But at the same token, you say that even though it's very hard for these armed rebellions to succeed, it's very hard for governments to eradicate them at the same time.
Almost impossible. And a large part of this is due to geography. So if you imagine that you're in charge of the Central African Republic or the Chad, it is incredibly difficult to even find these people, to track these people, and to do anything against them. Because there are some countries on Earth where the government isn't even close to anything approaching a monopoly on the use of force. So while the rebellions might not be able to win, the government can't win either. And that's why oftentimes you see these low-level rebellions that go on for years and decades, and the costs just keep increasing.
So armed rebellion is one thing, but then there's the threat to the tyrant of mass uprisings, widespread mass uprisings. Why are they more dangerous to a dictator than, say, an armed rebellion in most cases?
This, I think, is something that is really, really fascinating, because you could look at that moment and you could think to yourself that how on earth could the protesters possibly win? You know, you've got teenagers, you've got pensioners, you've got regular people. They have no guns, they have no Molotov cocktails, they have nothing. And on the other side, you have this entrenched dictatorships with all the guns and all the tanks. And yet, oftentimes, the protesters are able to win. And the mechanism by which it works is that if you mobilize enough people, the dictatorship will have to react, because the dictator cannot afford to look weak. So you start to send in the police and they start to beat people down. But obviously, in most cultures, beating down women and children does not make you popular. So the very next day, you could have even more people in the streets. Maybe this time it's 1 million, maybe it's 2 million. And in that moment, dictators have a fateful decision to make. Either they give an order to shoot, or they let the protest continue unimpeded. And again, this is a choice between the plague and cholera. It's a moment at which you cannot win. Because the problem, of course, is if you give an order to shoot, somebody still has to do the shooting. And often it is this ordinary soldier or this ordinary policeman who just refuses to do it. You know, they don't want to risk shooting their neighbors. They don't want to risk shooting their friends. So they just refuse. And when they refuse, you've got a bad situation turning apocalyptic because the regime is no longer in control. And the second element of that is that palace elites often refuse to go along with it. You know, they will have done a lot of bad stuff. They will have gone along with a lot, but they don't want this. And as a result, in that situation, you often have regimes collapsing under the weight of their own repression. And that's part of the reason why nonviolence is so important, because you don't want to give the regime an excuse, and you want to make it easier for those security services to refuse those orders. But truth be told, there are also strategies that tyrants can employ in order to maximize the chances of their security forces following those orders. So one of the things that you often see is that the regimes try to place the troops that are closest to the population that they're now supposed to shoot away from the front lines.
Right out, yeah.
Right out there. You don't want them to be anywhere near it. You want to draft in people from some other town or ideally from some other country. And this is, for example, how, you know, even 1,000 Russian paratroopers can make a massive difference if you send them to Kazakhstan or Belarus, even if they don't do any shooting. Because if you are that soldier and you are making that decision whether to shoot or not, and you turn around and you see a Russian paratroopers, your calculus is going to change, because you now think that it's much more likely that the regime is going to survive. And if you believe that, it makes much more sense to shoot.
So you have the situation where you have the mass uprising, the daily mass protests in the central square. The regime is defeated, the dictator is forced to leave. Does that improve the chances of the most desirable outcome, which is that democracy should follow the overthrow of the bad regime, if there is a non-violent uprising that's successful?
If it's possible, non-violence is the best solution to the problem. Researchers have found that if you bring down people through non-violence, it is much more likely to bring about a democratization than if you bring them down through a coup d'etat or perhaps a rebellion. And in a way that makes sense, because these movements have to bring together a lot of people in order to bring down the tyrant. And having brought together a lot of people gives them some legitimacy. And also, of course, their comparative advantage is non-violence, unlike coup plotters. When you have coup plotters coming into power, for example, what they are good at is using violence and threatening it. So they don't have an incentive to create a system in which that isn't valued. And for non-violent protesters, it's the opposite. They often want democracy because they're good at it.
The other way a tyrant might come down is through the gun of an assassin, and this seems to be something that really haunts the dictator, the tyrant, and give the tyrant sleepless nights. What are some of the calculuses that are at work here where the tyrant knows he's made a whole lot of enemies, some unknown, that could exist within the palace? A gun could emerge at any moment in his bedchamber in the middle of the night. How does that affect the tyrant's thinking, the fear of the assassin's bullet?
It's a curious challenge because you're in a situation in which millions of people inevitably hate you, and you have to interact with them in some way, and you could be killed at any moment. So obviously that will make it tougher for these people to think about much else. But tyrants do have some advantages. So if you're a democratic leader, you want to stay in power, you have to go out and meet regular people. You have to be in touch with them, if only at election rallies. If you're somebody like Putin, for example, you don't ever have to do that. You can either hide in your bunker or hide in the Kremlin, or people are pre-selected whenever they meet you. So that reduces the risk, but it never quite disappears. And it's something of a wild card. So for a lot of these threats, you can move them around. You can coup-proof, but then you become more vulnerable to an invasion. Or you can strengthen your military effectiveness, and then you become more vulnerable to a coup. But these assassinations are something that are very difficult to influence. And if anything, they might even find that if tyrants become too good at protecting themselves from other threats, an assassination becomes more likely because there are no more any other ways to hold them accountable.
And this brings us to, I think, what is, for me, the key insight I got from your book, Marcel, which is the sheer psychic agony of the dictator, the agony of the tyrant. They've clawed their way to that throne. They've killed God knows how many people to get there. They're sitting on the throne and they don't know a moment's peace or happiness once they're upon the throne. Is that a fair characterization of the life of most tyrants?
It is. They know that they're in danger. They know that they could be killed at any moment in time. And that's part of the reason why I struggle to understand why anybody would want to do it.
I think we have a picture that a tyrant is like Scrooge McDuck in a gigantic vault of gold coins throwing up in the air and going, ha, 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 ha. It's not like that at all, is it?
Maybe for a brief moment at the beginning, but very quickly it will turn into something much different from that.
So the life of the tyrant, most of the times, is a miserable one. And then they project their own misery on their captive peoples.
The only thing that I would say in defense of the tyrant, so to speak, is that, of course, a lot of the time, these people do not live in countries like Australia or New Zealand or modern Germany. But they're in a situation in which there is a dictator anyway, so it might as well be them.
So one day, as is the case in the 1950s, people wake up and Comrade Stalin, the great helmsman, has died in his sleep. He's died peacefully. He's managed to hang on despite the odds for all those decades, but now he's no longer there. What are the odds of a shift to democracy if the tyrant dies in a peaceful death in his own bed?
You could think that that's the biggest possible opening. The tyrant is no longer around. It's a clean slate. You can do something altogether different, perhaps even a democracy. But in the real world, what often happens is that the people that have kept the previous tyrant around and that kept him in power sit around a table and they try to figure out what to do next. And they, of course, are not necessarily interested in the tyrant as an individual, but in the system of tyranny, because it is that tyranny that gives them the money and that gives them the wealth. So usually they don't have an interest in democratization because that's going to take it away from them. So you see this over and over again. You saw it in Syria, for example, when when Assad the Elder died, but you also see it in the Soviet Union, you see it in North Korea. The elites want the system to continue, and as a result, it often does.
Tyrants not only bring terror, corruption, war, mass violence, mass murder, then they also poison the ground they leave behind. The message seems very clear from your book. Do not let these people get a foothold in your democracy. How strongly do you feel this, Marcel?
Incredibly. And part of the reason, again, is structural. Tyrants, when they're in power, usually try to destroy independent institutions, or they try to capture them to use them for their own ends. And they build the entire system around themselves. So when the tyrant is no longer around because he's been toppled or because he has just fallen asleep, the problem is what comes next. There's nothing really that can adjudicate the conflict between different successors aside from those elites. So once you have fallen into that trap, once you have had a tyrant in power, it is very difficult to improve things from there on out. But I have to say that, working on this topic has actually made me more optimistic about the future of democracy than I've ever been.
That's nice to hear. Please give me grounds for this optimism, Marcel.
I spend so much time looking at the weaknesses of these systems that I've just become convinced that our system is better. And I think there are two main reasons. Our leaders have to do some good things for us some of the time. Not because they like us or because they're good people, but because they want to maintain power. So they have to build hospitals. They have to build roads. They have to build schools. And the added advantage that we have is that when our leaders mess up, we can course correct. We can get rid of them. We can do something different. We can try something different. And this is, of course, something that is much more difficult to do under tyranny.
Marcel, it's been fascinating speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Marcel Dirsus' book is How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
Today's conversation was created on the lands of the Gadigal people. Producer was Maggie Morris with assistance from Matteo Bascaran. Executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.